Welcome to The Lead, the New Lines Magazine podcast. I'm Faisal Yafai, and this is a podcast where we delve into the biggest ideas, events and personalities from around the world. As we go into 2025, it feels as though many of the stories of which we saw the first chapter, perhaps the first few chapters over the past year, have not yet reached their final conclusions. The war in Gaza continues to rage, as does the war in Ukraine. In one of 2024's most dramatic moments, the regime of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad collapsed almost overnight, leaving so many Syria watchers wondering what would come next. And of course, Donald Trump was elected to the White House for a second time, heralding, depending on your opinion, the return of America to long-lost greatness or the beginning of the end of American democracy. And so, what of 2025? What will the second Trump term bring, and what impact will it have around the globe? And what of Europe's liberal democracies, of the Middle East, of a new Syria? Will some of those seemingly intractable conflicts finally be brought to a kind of close? Or will 2025 just be another chapter in a long story? With me to discuss these questions and more are New Lines' politics editor Danny Postel, Europe editor Lisa Goldman, and our Middle East editor Kareem Shaheen. Welcome to you all.
Hello.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, Faisal.
I imagine that the story of Trump will dominate this whole year. And so, but before we get to it, I think I want to approach it from a slightly different angle. And I wanted to take your mind back to something that happened during the first Trump administration. The media company Vice put together 24 things that nobody does better than Trump. And it was just a list of Trump saying, nobody does the military better than I do. Nobody does building walls better than I do. No one's tougher on ISIS than I am. And so Axios, in the run-up to the next Trump presidency, put together a list of things that Donald Trump has said he will do on his first year in office. And this is a compilation. They compiled it from 122 speeches. And it's things we've heard, like settle the Russia-Ukraine war, shut the border, begin the largest deportation operation. But it's also things that perhaps have fallen off the radar a little bit, like bring competence and common sense back to the Oval Office, shift parts of the federal government enforcement to immigration, revoke China's most favored nation status, reverse every Biden-Harris disaster. The disaster is in quotes. And so I guess the question I want to start off with, and I think maybe Danny first, is how many of these promises do you think will happen on day one?
Well, we'll see. I think that the biggest one of all of them is immigration. And I say this as someone who's attended Trump rallies, and it was really striking to me. I mean, his rallies tend to go on, and he has a long litany of issues that he brings up. He weaves back and forth famously. But the one through line, the most consistent theme that he drills on is immigration. And what struck me attending a Trump rally last summer in Wisconsin was what a two-way street it was. Because a lot of the issues he focuses on, his own pet issues that, might get a little bit of a reaction from the crowd, depending on how he frames it or who he's skewering. But with immigration, you see the biggest response in the crowd. You saw this also at the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee over the summer, with the signs that said mass deportations now. This was an actual slogan that was, was operational. Yeah,
but do you think, Danny, that he will do it? Because I really want to think about what might happen on day one with all these promises that he's made. And if you're correct in understanding that immigration is such an important part to his base, do you think the largest deportation operation will happen on that day?
I think they will attempt to. Obviously, the scale of the operation that they've discussed is so vast that it will take, many months, if not years, to fully execute it. But I think that there's no question that they're going to begin on day one. And I say that because look at two people. The two names you have to keep in mind here are Stephen Miller and Tom Homan. Now, these are people from the first Trump administration, but he has now elevated them inside the White House to much higher levels. So Stephen Miller will be the White House Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy. and also the president's Homeland Security advisor. He'll occupy both of those positions. And he was the key architect of two of the most controversial policies in the first Trump administration, the so-called Muslim ban and the family separation or child separation policy. Now, Tom Homan will be Trump's border czar. He was the acting director of ICE, or Immigration and Customs Enforcement, for the first roughly year and a half of Trump's first go. And he was also deeply involved with the family separation or child separation policy. But now he's being elevated to a position inside the White House where he'll work very closely with Stephen Miller. And the fact that Miller and Homan are going to be occupying these two critical positions in the White House suggests the priority of immigration in the Trump administration, and they're already gearing up for a fight.
Okay, so this is why I think it's so interesting to get into it, because when you look at the list of things that Trump has said he'll do on day one, sometimes you imagine that a lot of it is just rhetoric. But it sounds like when you talk about the detail of these people and the figures involved, and some of them, like Stephen Miller, have a track record, they clearly intend to do a lot of this stuff. I wonder, Kareem and Lisa, because let's just turn to some of the other things that Trump has promised. The two that stand out are that he'll end the war in Ukraine on day one, and actually he will end the Gaza war even before. So I wonder if you think that against the background of the domestic things that he's trying to do, he will actually manage to be able to do that.
Well, I think it's quite. I do hope he does manage to end those two wars. I mean, you have to question the actual end goal of what he's trying to do and differentiate it, I think, from the method that he gets to it. So ending the Ukraine war is a positive development for the world. So is ending the war on Gaza. But how he gets to it, he said, if the hostages aren't released before he comes into office, everybody's going to be sorry, essentially. That he's
all hell will break out.
Exactly. All hell will break out in the Middle East, as though, hell hasn't broken out in the Middle East for the past couple of years, regardless. So I think there's an interest in understanding how he will pursue those goals. He's given mixed signals about who he supports and how he wants to go about ending some of these conflicts. But I will say that his desire and his stated desire to do these grand foreign policy adventures are interesting because they force people into a position of trying to contemplate an end to conflicts that seem insurmountable or that seem without end. So he forces people to kind of imagine the possibility of an end to the war in Gaza or an end to the war in Ukraine, regardless of how we get to that end point. And I think that that's an interesting thought experiment in and of itself, because his perception is very much that he's someone who is just willing to cut a deal regardless, and so is not ideological in the real sense. Now, whether his intervention is going to lead to disaster or not remains to be seen, but the idea that he wants an end to these conflicts and he wants to tick that box as a victory for his way of doing politics is one that I think people are willing to work with, because of the fact that he is someone who is not perceived as ideological and indeed someone without any actual overarching values. And so you can negotiate with him on a potentially level ground.
But don't you think, Kareem, if we're talking about the aim being laudable, let's end the Ukraine war and the Gaza war, actually the detail of how you get to that place really matters. So Lisa, I'm thinking in particular about the Ukraine war. And of course, it's a positive thing to end the Ukraine war. But if you're ending it without any values, as Kareem says, then you're likely to end it on the terms that currently exist, the status quo that is current now. And that isn't going to be a positive end. So I guess the question I'm really raising with you is, if, as Kareem says, there is a laudable aim in ending these conflicts, is there not a problem in trying to end them so rapidly?
Of course, if these conflicts could have been ended, then Biden would have ended them. I mean, if they could have been ended without causing great grief to the weaker parties or to the parties under attack, then he would have ended them. I think that's pretty obvious. I think for me, it's very useful to look at Trump as someone who has no ideology and who's strictly transactional. And there are only two things he cares about, right? Money and power, right? Doesn't care about anything else. So I don't think he particularly cares what happens in Gaza. From the Israeli perspective, in terms, I mean, even though they still have soldiers fighting in Gaza and there's a lot of killing going on, as far as the Israelis are concerned, the war is basically over in Gaza, but there's also no exit plan at all. And I don't think Trump really cares what happens in Gaza, as long as it doesn't affect his personal power or wealth. So I don't see any end coming in Gaza, no, and I don't see any good coming in Ukraine either.
We'll come back to the specificities of Ukraine and Gaza, but I kind of want to keep going on this idea that Kareem has rather provocatively brought up, that actually there might be some benefit in simply ending these intractable conflicts on any term. Danny, let me come back to you on it. When you think about something as large as mass deportation, if we can find... We're kind of slightly being sucked into Kareem's worldview now, but if we can find some laudable aim at the heart of it, which might be most people do want stricter border controls, most people do want to feel that there's a kind of fairness to people entering the United States. If we can take that as the laudable aim, and given that it is very hard, the United States has an enormously long border, it is very, very difficult. Do you not think that there is some value in him simply saying, however intractable it is, I'm going to solve this one way or the other, and we move on?
I mean, look, on the one hand, I have two answers to that. One is to say that I think it's mostly a phony issue. Not in principle, like the idea of having a secure border, of not having criminals come into the country, of having a fair system. In principle, those are unproblematic goals. But the way that Trump has framed the immigration issue over the last several years, beginning in 2015, with his very announcement that he was running for president for the first time, talking about Mexican rapists and criminals, this is a demonological narrative rather than a serious policy discussion. The language that he uses of migrants coming in and poisoning the blood of our country, of doing these horrific things. I mean, the statistics simply don't bear this out. This picture that you get, this narrative from Trump world of a mob of migrants invading the United States, this language of invasion, of criminals coming across the border, this is just nonsense. It's a scare tactic.
Right. But you think that even though it is a fiction, it is still a fiction that he's going to seek to solve, just like he built parts of this wall.
Yes, and it's essential. It's absolutely central to his message. It has been since he announced in 2015, and it's become, I would say, even more central now in this second Trump go. I think it will be the key domestic policy front for Trump. But I think that the paradox on the Democratic side, Faisal, is that Democrats feel like that this was a losing issue for them in the 2024 election. Like Kamala Harris, as a representative of the Biden administration, right? There was a widespread perception that Biden, especially in the first 2-3 years of his administration, simply let all of these migrants in. The asylum system is broken. There was virtually no control. The border was porous. And this allowed Trump, it gave Trump a lot of ammunition. And the issue simply pulls people who, at least according to data that we have now, according to polling, people who care deeply about the issue of immigration voted overwhelmingly for Trump. People on the other side who may be skeptical or very critical of Trump's more draconian measures and anti-immigrant posture, they didn't vote on that issue. They voted on other issues. It wasn't as high of a priority. So I think that Democrats right now, although on the one hand, they're going to have to respond to the Trump administration's massive deportation and detention scheme, but they're doing so with a bit of hesitation because they know that the public, they feel like, look, Trump was elected partly on this issue of immigration. Well, so there's a popular mandate.
This is exactly right. I mean, even if you think that the issue itself is fiction, as you clearly do, he has been elected on that proposal. And therefore, even if it is a fictional policy that he's going to try to implement, he's going to have to do some parts of it, just like I said, just like building the wall. He has to go part way towards it.
Can I just jump in for very quickly just on this point? Just the statistics don't really matter. The thing is that a big part, I think, of the Democratic and liberal writ large attitude towards the immigration issue has always been that it's not quite real. And they may well be right about this, but the way it ends up being played out in terms of the electorate is that the Democrats or the liberals in Canada or liberals in Europe will come out essentially and say, hey, this is not really all that stuff you're feeling is not really true. It might be a little bit bad for you specifically, but it's not that way writ large. And this applies to issues like inflation, issues like grocery bills and things like that. They'll say, hey, look, the overall metrics look good. The economy is doing pretty well, even if things might be a little bit bad for you personally and specifically. And this just does not work as an electoral policy. You can't just tell people, hey, yeah, I know you're feeling hurt right now, or I know you're economically it's a little bit difficult, but tough noogies, like everyone else is doing pretty well, and so in general things are good. And so statistics when it comes to issues like immigration don't really matter if people have the vibe session impression that their societies are changing, that there are new rules, all the fake disinformation going on in social media telling people to be scared of migrants or trying to change the rules in their countries, whether that's in Germany or France or elsewhere. All that stuff, the statistics don't really matter if you have a politician who can speak to those fears in a way that's compelling.
I just want to bolster what Kareem said with 3 concrete examples. Okay, people can't afford to buy a house. People's grocery bills have gone up 20 to 30%. And in the big cities like New York, where I was visiting just recently, you see people sitting in the middle of the sidewalk in a prosperous neighborhood shooting up drugs while cops watch from a few meters away and do nothing because there's nothing to do. Now, maybe people who make policy are not affected by the drug use on the streets, which makes people feel very insecure when they're on the subway or walking the sidewalks. Maybe they won't notice if their grocery bill is $500 a month or $650 a month. And maybe it really doesn't matter to them if a house costs $1 million or $2.5 million because they have that much money. But for ordinary people, middle-class people, that's very, very significant. And it feels really insulting, like you're being gaslit when politicians go on the news podcasts for the Daily and other news analysis podcasts and say, people might be saying this, but it's not actually true. And it's, obviously for the people who are experiencing these financial troubles, it's very real.
I think those financial troubles are very real. The economic pain is not fictional. It's very real. But immigrants are not the reason. They're not the cause for this. And that part of it is, to me, an ideological scapegoating game that Trump and other authoritarian populists and nativist demagogues play very effectively. It works, but it's false. The economic pain is real. The economic pain is real, but the immigrants are not the cause. That's a diversion.
Yeah, obviously. Yeah, for sure. And that's because these guys are lazy and stupid and they don't know how to make economic change. They don't know how to implement good economic policies, or maybe they just don't want to because the only thing they really care about is their own personal wealth and power.
I think to some degree, there is you create the political reality that people experience. So I think the underlying reality in the society, in lots of these societies, is as you describe it. Prices are going up, people feel very insecure, all of that stuff. It's also a generational thing. There's a very strong sense, and now statistics to back it up, that generations will not do as well as their parents did, which is a shocking indictment of the rich world, and a change in the kind of underlying belief structure that these post-war societies have felt was essential. But I think the more important point about this year is when Trump comes into office, if he is creating the political reality for a lot of people, do you not think that in some way shifts the society? So even if it's not true that it is immigrants that are causing these issues, the very fact that he's going to say it is and going to act as if it is shifts the society in that direction to the point where, as Kareem was saying at the very beginning of this, it's kind of almost indistinguishable from reality. People act as if.
Well, it is real in a sense because Trump is saying what people have, the conclusions that people have arrived at. I think in general, people are fond of telling Western societies that, hey, if you vote against immigration, then you won't have people picking your strawberries or doing the jobs that you don't want to do, and your economies will decline. They won't grow as fast if you have tariffs and closed borders and isolationist sentiments and low immigration and things like that. Particularly in a place like Canada, which needs actual immigrants, and I think we'll get to it in a little bit. But people have simply decided that they are going to vote for candidates that are anti-immigration, regardless of those issues. It's not that people are ignorant of the potential economic impact of voting for less skilled immigration or less unskilled immigration. People have already heard the argument being made, and they've decided that they want to vote for someone like Trump, who's going to put an end to immigration regardless.
This conversation is really meant to be about the future of 2025 and what will happen. But I think, and I want to come to you, Danny, on this, I think the reason why it's very interesting is that what Kareem, and to some degree Lisa as well, is agreeing with is something that I think goes against the worldview that you are espousing. So that's the first part. But the second part is that it goes to the larger point in the United States context about the story that the Democrats have been able to tell the public. And it certainly seems, given how wide the margin of Trump's victory was, and given what people already know about the first Trump presidency and also about his personal and legal troubles, it speaks to the fact that the Democrats don't seem to be able to have crafted a political story that resonated with people and with people's daily reality. I think the point that is being expressed by Kareem, and to some degree Lisa, is that there is an underlying political reality that many Americans are experiencing, and Canadians and other countries as well. They're experiencing this reality. They look at Trump. He seems to be speaking about that reality. Whether they agree or even believe his solutions is one topic, but he is at least addressing that reality, and the story that the Democrats are telling does not address that reality.
I think that's a real problem. And immigration, as I mentioned, was a real losing issue for the Democrats and a real winning issue for Trump. Just to put a finer point on that, there are lots and lots of pro-refugee and immigrant rights activists and organizations here in the United States who are now mobilizing, getting ready to respond to the Trump administration's deportation and detention plans. People in that realm, their views are closer to the Democratic Party than to the Republican Party, but they also saw Kamala Harris shift to the right and the Democratic Party shift to the right on immigration in response to the Trump campaign and try to almost outmaneuver and say, no, we're just as tough on immigration and we want to secure the border just as much as Trump does. But, that's a losing proposition because people who care deeply about securing the border and keeping immigrants out, they're already voting for Trump no matter what. That vote is not up for grabs.
Right.
They
want the original, the full fat version.
That they want the unadulterated version. And then people on the left in the progressive world who are concerned about the issue of immigration, that kind of triangulation, tacking to the right that Harris did, that just alienates them. And a lot of them didn't vote for Harris, partly over that issue. Other progressives, of course, didn't vote for Harris over Gaza. But the point is that this immigration issue, although I maintain that it is a highly manipulated issue and it's an ideological kind of distorting mirror, nonetheless, it does work. It is successful. It's an issue that the Republicans own, especially MAGA. I mean, remember, there was a debate within the Republican Party over this. The Republican Party wasn't anti-immigrant in the way that it is now. As recently as the last Republican president before Trump, George W. Bush, was fairly pro-immigrant. So was Ronald Reagan, for that matter. So there's always been a war within the Republican Party between the sort of open borders, free market, Wall Street, cheap labor wing of the party and the nativist, xenophobic, anti-immigrant wing of the party, but the latter has clearly triumphed. And the Democrats don't really have an answer to it. They're incoherent on this issue. So I agree on that front.
Let's talk about some of the other changes that might come this year, moving further afield from Europe and the United States. Kareem, one of the the biggest news stories of 2024. Perhaps the news story that I think many of us on the team were most surprised by was the sudden collapse of the regime of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. We're now almost a month after the event, and as the initial emotion of that moment starts to subside, what do you think is becoming clearer about what might lie ahead for Syria?
Yeah, so the story is obviously a very complex one as we're kind of grappling with the idea of Syria actually building or trying to build a functional state in the aftermath of the uprising. You're going to have basic issues such as how to fund public sector salaries or what to do about the curriculum and changes to the school curriculum. We're coming up to a big scheduled national conference to discuss the path forward, the transitional path forward, whether that's about the timeline for elections, how the country is going to be governed in the interim, plans for a constitution. I know one of our colleagues, Rashal Als, is working on a big piece on the Syrian constitution and constitutional reform in the country. So those are some of the big picture issues. There's also the question of geopolitics. Syria is obviously going to be now more closely aligned to its Arab neighbors. There's a question of lifting sanctions in order to allow the country to flourish economically. The U.S. has already taken some positive steps in terms of lifting sanctions temporarily on certain sectors in order to allow all of this to go forward. The Europeans are, as usual, dragging their feet because they want Syria to commit and show commitment to diversity and its electoral politicking, obviously guarantee the rights of minorities, which is an important issue. But let's remember that these sanctions were placed on Syria in the first place in order to punish the Assad regime. And now that the Assad regime has fallen, there should be some immediate mechanism to try and alter this situation. There are also some key questions about Syria's neighbors like Israel and how it's going to interact with the new government over there. These are all key questions, obviously, for the region. But I do think that the bigger theme that we need to address and we need to think about, there's one aspect of it in the West that we need to try and start revising our perception of what terrorism is. Obviously, the group that that brought down the Assad regime is Hayat Tahrir Sham, which has had ties to Al-Qaeda and ISIS before that they've severed. But the designation of the group as a terrorist group and the group has been trying to rebrand as this national liberation movement poses important questions for us in the West because the architects of the war on terror sought to fight transnational jihadism. And as our colleague, our editor-in-chief, Hassan made multiple times in columns over the past few weeks, is that this designation has been an artifact of the war on terror, and jihadist groups, as we knew them in the past, have evolved into these sorts of national liberation movements. And we're going to need to think how we deal with groups like HTS or the Taliban in Afghanistan and others in a different way and how we understand them. And the other aspect of it is these authoritarian regimes are super fragile. The Assad regime, which has fought a 14-year civil war, collapsed over the course of 10 days. And to the point where not even the rebel groups that launched the campaign, they didn't even expect it. So it opens the question of how many of the authoritarian regimes in the region that have been destabilized by change and by popular protests and other sorts of movements and rebellions, how survivable are they? How is American, Canadian, European policy going to shift in the region from the previous fallacy of let's support stability by supporting all those authoritarian regimes, and how is it going to evolve as these regimes appear shakier than ever?
We're coming to the part of the show where I'm going to try to get predictions for the year out of you. So I suppose in the context of Syria, the starting point might be, what do you think we might see in Syria this year? How many of the topics that you have articulated just now will tend towards some kind of resolution?
I think it's going to be a long-term issue. I think the important thing about Syria is that over the course of 14 years, an actual civil society grassroots civil society thrived, whether that's outside the country, whether that's in rebel-controlled territories, whether that manifested in growing awareness within government-controlled areas about the rights and responsibilities of citizenship and of being part of the country. In addition to that, we're seeing all of the reclamation of documents and evidence of the regime's atrocities, whether in its prisons or in how it conducted politics and how it spied on its own citizens. And there's going to be a huge push for accountability there. I do think that it's going to be a fascinating year, obviously, for Syrians, but I do think that they are well equipped to handle the debates coming up, whether that's issues like devising a new constitution or reforming the current one, whether that's a question of how fast and how to hold elections, whether that's the questions of political dissent, or there's a question of protecting minorities and preserving their rights. I think all of these issues are going to come to the fore over the next year as the real work of reforming one of the worst totalitarian systems humanity has ever devised goes forward. And I made this point in our previous Syria podcast. I really do think that Syrians have developed a political consciousness over the past almost decade and a half of conflict that other Arab countries have not been able to because of an arrested development in their political evolution. And so my prediction is that they will obviously go through a lot of these debates, but my prediction is also that it's going to be more positive than people who are urging caution right now expect it to look like, because of this evolved political consciousness that Syrians have developed over the course of a very brutal civil war.
Lisa, let's talk about another country or countries in the region, the Gaza war in Israel-Palestine. What do you think? You said earlier that you think the war is essentially over. It hasn't really politically ended. What do you think this year and this second Trump term will mean for Israel and Palestine?
It'll be more of the same, but just with much more unfettered rhetoric. The Israeli army has no exit plan for Gaza. There's no policy for Gaza. There actually hasn't been a policy for Gaza since 2006, let's face it. When in 2005, 2006, when Israel withdrew its bases and settlements from Gaza. There's been no settlement. There's been no policy except for containment. And right now what we're seeing is that the extreme right of Netanyahu's government, which represents the most violent, ideological, messianist, extremist settlers, they want to return the settlements to Gaza that were withdrawn in 2005 in the north of Gaza. They'll probably do that. I think that the Israeli army will continue to have military incursions into the rest of Gaza. I think that there's just unending bleak violence. There's no plan to withdraw, and I don't think there's a way to withdraw.
Do you think that violence will end with the arrival of Trump, or do you think that the Israelis will continue to bomb Gaza?
They'll continue to bomb Gaza. I don't think Trump cares at all about Gaza. And as long as it doesn't affect his lucrative arrangements with Saudi Arabia, I don't think he's going to intervene. And I'm sure he won't. And in the West Bank, I think that the Ben Gvir contingent, they're actively, unabashedly, and undeniably right now in the process of annexing Area C, the largest area of the West Bank. They're doing that with maximum violence. Even the former directors of the Shin Bet have been warning the government that there's a bloodbath going on, falling on deaf ears. The army command has been completely taken over by far-right settlers. And I think that these people are looking for a spark that would allow them to go into the West Bank the way the army went into Gaza.
Do you imagine that if we are talking at the end of this year, that there will have been any you think the war will continue, but do you think there will be any movement on accountability for the crimes of the war?
There could be abroad. I think that international law is getting a little teethier. And certainly there have been several reports in the Hebrew language Israeli media, both television and print, and also radio, about Israeli soldiers, military officers who are traveling as civilians to places like Sri Lanka, where they have had to abruptly, and because of warnings from local Israeli diplomats, they've had to leave. Because they've had to run away because somebody has called up Interpol and said that, you have to follow up your directive to arrest soldiers because the ICJ has said that these people must be brought to justice for their, criminal acts in Gaza. So Israelis are certainly feeling quite beleaguered. They're feeling that the world is becoming smaller for them and not in a good way. But in terms of that affecting Israeli policy, the answer is it will not. And the reason is that Israelis feel the world is very much against them, except for their BFF in Washington, D.C., and that they are being very unjustly accused of committing crimes when in fact they're just protecting themselves. And I don't see any changes in policy. I think things are going to get even quite a lot worse in the coming year in Israel and Palestine.
Let's talk about, we've talked a little bit about Ukraine and Russia, but let's just come back to it and try to nail down some possible predictions for this year. A while back, we had the Ukrainian-born journalist Yaroslav Trofimov on the podcast, and he argued that Trump's hardline stance when it came to defense spending among NATO members actually strengthened the alliance. Danny, I think I'll bring you in here about Ukraine and Russia. Do you think that the way Trump might try to end this war in a very firm, draw any line in the sand, let's just get it over with way, that might actually give a kind of boost to these beleaguered Western alliances?
I guess I'll answer that question by talking about a sort of internal tension within the Trump administration's approach to these questions more broadly. And this was also the case in the first Trump administration. You had a very strong emphasis on America first, isolationist, almost anti-interventionism, right? Let's get America out of these foreign entanglements, bring the troops home, and not be attempting regime change all over the world. That was part of Trump's critique of George W. Bush's foreign policy, which in many ways helped him win the nomination in 2016, the Republican nomination against Bush's brother, Jeb. That was a defining feature of Trump's foreign policy vision. So on the one hand, you had that. On the other hand, he put John Bolton in his administration. So
longest-serving national security advisor.
There you go. So now, this time around, you have more what you might call ideological consolidation within Trump world. Trump doesn't feel the need to placate the foreign policy establishment or the old guard of the Republican Party nearly as much as he did the first time. He has Marco Rubio as Secretary of State, which is interesting because on the one hand, Rubio has become Trumpified, certainly on domestic politics. He went from being one of the biggest thorn in Trump's side, especially when he was running for president against Trump in the 2016 Republican primary. He's become basically a Trump loyalist. So basically, Rubio, although he has become rather Trumpified on domestic politics, remains essentially a neocon and a muscular interventionist, a hawk on foreign policy. And the really hardcore sort of paleocon, America first isolationists in Trump world are very unhappy about the Rubio pick and very worried about what he might do. So on Ukraine, we'll see. I mean, Rubio comes from that tough on Russia camp, but he's also made some noises about wanting to resolve the war as quickly as possible. So you have that. You also have Tulsi Gabbard as DNI, Director of National Intelligence, and she comes much more out of that isolationist, anti-interventionist, America first, and I would even say pro-Putin. She's not just an isolationist, and I made this point in the podcast we recorded right after the election. To answer your question, Faisal, it's not clear what all of this will mean for Trump's actual policies on the Russia-Ukraine war, but I think it's certainly going to be a shift away from Biden's steadfast support for Ukraine. Putin and company are certainly very happy that they have friendlier forces in the White House now. And J.D. Vance, although the vice president is famously a not terribly important position, I think J.D. Vance is an important figure here. He's another one closer to Tucker Carlson, who's essentially pro-Putin.
Right. Let me push you towards a prediction, because Kareem has predicted that Syria will not be a stable democracy by the end of the year, but a lot of the thought process has already been done, and so we might end up moving towards that position by the end of the year. Lisa has suggested that the war in Gaza will not end. Where do you stand on the war in Ukraine as a prediction by the end of this year?
I don't think it will end, because I think that the terms that will be presented by Trump to the Ukrainians will simply be unacceptable to the Ukrainians. And then that will be portrayed internationally as the Ukrainians being stubborn and not willing to negotiate, not wanting peace, when in fact, the terms will simply be unacceptable to most Ukrainians. So I think that the war will go on.
Okay, let's end now by thinking about, I'll go around to the three of you and tell me, what story do you think will be a big issue in 2025 that we are not currently looking at? Let's start with Kareem.
Okay, well, I do think that now, over the course of the year, where conservatives are actually in power, people are going to realize how little they give a damn about the things that they've actually said that they do. So we're going to start seeing a situation in which, if there are no improvements to things like housing costs, to things like grocery bills and inflation and so on, that conservatives are going to start to pay the price for, honestly, their unsustainable governing coalitions. You look at somebody like Trump, who in public is openly racist, gleaning the support of Hispanics and Arabs who are angry about the Biden administration's policy on Gaza. And those contradictions, I think, are going to come to a head. They're going to have to balance all of these contradictions. They're going to have to do that while also restricting immigration and trying to grow their economies amidst increasing isolationism and tariffs and things like that. And whether their experiment actually ends up working out or not, they're going to start paying the political costs for these things that they've said they're going to do that aren't going to be easy fixes to a lot of these situations. You're already seeing this with Trump yesterday, talking about wanting to annex Greenland, wanting to take over the Panama Canal. Where's the anti-war leader who is going to protect America from the rest of the world and sever its links to the rest of the world in a lot of ways, both militarily and economically? So I think the weight of these contradictions is going to start coming to the fore, and we're going to start seeing the conservatives actually struggle with trying to keep together these absurd coalitions that they've formed over the past few years. And on the other side, I think you're also going to see the ramifications of what happened in Syria and the region in the Middle East writ large, where we're going to start seeing, I think, some destabilization, some movement in a lot of these countries in terms of political reforms. We're already seeing Saudi Arabia releasing a lot of political prisoners over the past few days. Egypt is obviously very nervous about the situation in Syria and about the possibility of a resurgence of protests, however unlikely that is. But I think you're going to start seeing these reverberations and second-degree effects pretty soon.
Very good. I will come to Lisa for the last word. So, Danny, what story do you think will be a big issue that we're not looking at?
Kash Patel. We'll see if he is confirmed as FBI director, but if he is, I think that this is going to be a huge story because he's very serious about retribution, about going after Trump's political enemies, critics, going after the media, prosecuting journalists, prosecuting activists.
And then, Lisa, lastly, what do you think will be a big issue that we're not currently looking at?
I'm terrible at predictions, so I'll just go with trends. And I will say that the current trend of ongoing annexation of the West Bank is going to accelerate and become more violent and more widespread. And I think that all eyes have been on Gaza, and the international media has been covering the story of the ongoing annexation of the West Bank, but they're not using the word annexation. They're just reporting incidents of violence against Palestinians committed by settlers, which have been increasing at scale over the past few months. So I think that's just going to continue on at an accelerated pace. And we could see during the Trump administration's first months that Israel just outrightly announces it's annexed the Area C of the West Bank, and the Trump administration says, yep, whatever.
Well, we'll leave it at that. I think that's some very thoughtful responses. A little bit pessimistic, I think, and surprisingly optimistic from Kareem, of all people. A lot of these topics we will be coming back to in the next few weeks as we prepare for the inauguration and as we follow what is happening in Syria. But for now, Lisa Goldman, Kareem Shaheen, and Danny Postel, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Faisal. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.
A pleasure, Faisal.
This has been The Lead from New Lines Magazine. To listen to the interview with Yaroslav Trofimov, follow the link in the show notes. You can find Danny Postel on Twitter at Danny Postel. Lisa Goldman is at LisaNG, and Kareem Shaheen is at KShaheen. If you enjoyed today's episode, why not take a moment to rate the show on your podcast app and leave us a review? This week's episode was produced by Finbar Anderson and hosted by me, Faisal Yafai. For more like this, subscribe to The Lead on your favourite podcast app or visit our website, newlinesmag.com.